good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you today. I have some slides to share, but we don't have to go through that passing the ball back and forth, so I'll just kind of give us the quick overview here. But again, thanks for joining us for the DeltaX webinar today. We'll hear from Dr. Marc Simard on the DeltaX experiment. As we are aware, but it's good to remind ourselves what we're here to do and what our role is within US CLIVAR. But the role of US CLIVAR is to foster understanding and the prediction of climate variability and change, particularly in interseasonal to centennial timescales. We serve the climate community and society through the coordination and facilitation of research on outstanding climate questions, and we also coordinate and advance research in order to improve the documentation, understanding, and modeling of variations in global climate and regional climate, specifically as it relates to the ocean. So we are the Process Study and Model Improvement Panel, and our mission is to reduce uncertainties in general circulation models that are used for climate variability and prediction, and as well as climate change projections. And we do this, and our focus is primarily on improved understanding and representation of physical processes that are governing the climate and its variation. So part of our terms of reference as a group is to review and prioritize and coordinate process studies, and that's part of our webinar series today, where we're going to hear from DeltaX. DeltaX is a NASA Earth Venture Orbital 3 mission, and it has, perusing the science team, it has a very interdisciplinary science team of ecologists and radar scientists, hydrologists, and geomorphologists, and others as well. And so I think this will be a great seminar for us to hear about how well this group and tips for organizing field experiments across process studies with a wide range of different scientific disciplines. So we're going to hear from Marc Simard today, who's a scientist at JPL and the DeltaX PI. He studies vegetation structure and how it interacts with both environmental and geophysical variables. He's a member also of the SWAT science team. And the SWAT mission is designed to revolutionize our understanding of the hydrological and ecological processes in the coastal region. And on your DeltaX website, I also found your hobbies, so I thought that was very interesting, and I'd love to share some of those, including playing ice hockey, of course, salsa dancing, which I'm very interested in. So my wife and I salsa dance as well, and then building woodsheds, traveling, and organizing events. So that is our introduction to Marc, and now I'll turn it over to you to tell us all about DeltaX.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm really impressed by your research here. I'm at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the Radar Science and Engineering section. So my background is more physics. I'm coming from the remote sensing world and applying it to coastal areas. So the DeltaX mission was a very long process. Writing the proposal took over a year. Then you wait for the panel and then the announcements and everything. I think we started in 2017 or 16 or 17 working on that. And there's, of course, some prep work required to this, in particular, some investment in a 2016 campaign that we had to demonstrate some of those measurements. So there was some footwork before even writing the proposal. So today I will be presenting where we're at, but a little bit of introduction. So my main research interest is on the land-ocean aquatic continuum, for short LOAC. These include mangroves, as well as salt and freshwater marshes that are impacted by the tide. So these ecosystems are, of course, threatened by sea level rise, among other things like storm surges. They can, to keep up with sea level rise, they can either rise with sea level rise, or they can go upland, inland. However, the issue is that typically you will have infrastructure in the back, which means they cannot go inland, and you have the squeeze between infrastructure and sea level rise. So the only way to keep up with sea level rise is to build soil elevation. There are two processes by which this can be done. One of them is, of course, deposition of mineral sediments on the soil and accumulation, so rising the soil. And the other process is through plant production. So as the vegetation grows roots, it also builds soil elevation. So you have mineral sediment deposition and organic plant production. Okay, so you have these two processes. So the overarching science question for DeltaX is, will river deltas completely drawn or some parts of these deltas accumulate sufficient sediments and produce enough plants to keep pace with relative sea level rise? So knowing which parts of the deltas are doomed and which ones have a potential to make it can also help in assigning resources to these different parts, right? Because some of those deltas, like the Mississippi River Delta, is gigantic. So it's good to know where to put your resources beforehand. So the DeltaX objectives, there are two. So one is to evaluate the role of vegetation on soil accretion rates. And the other one is to evaluate the role of channel network density and deltaic island size on soil accretion rates. So basically, it's looking at these two processes I was just talking about, the vegetation contribution and the mineral sediment deposition component. So DeltaX initially was, the proposal included 3 deltas which spanned the entire latitudinal gradient. So we had the Magdalena River Delta in Colombia, which was our tropical delta with mangroves. We had the Mississippi River Delta and the Mackenzie River Delta in the Northwest Territories of Canada. So we had the Arctic Delta as well. However, it was funded at the threshold level that we had offered, and that was only on the Mississippi River Delta, which means the research that we are doing applies to about 20% of all river deltas worldwide. So we focus on the Mississippi River Delta. The basin drains about 41% of the conterminous United States. That's about 150 million tons of sediment, mineral sediment per year that are brought to the Mississippi River. However, this, as you know, is all channelized, right? So most of those sediment is just flushed right to the Gulf of Mexico because of it's been channelized. So if you look at take a closer look at the Mississippi River Delta, this is here I'm looking at the 2 basins, the Atchafalaya Basin on the right, which takes about 30% of the discharge of the Mississippi River, and the Terrebonne Basin, which is at the center of the image here, which is not fed by sediments. So you can see that in the Atchafalaya Basin on the left here, you have growth of the deltas, which is the Wax Lake Outlet, Wax Lake Delta, and the Atchafalaya Delta. And within the Terrebonne Basin, you're just losing land. You're not building any land. So currently in the Mississippi River Delta, we're losing about 56 kilometers square of land every single year. If you take that, you spread out this loss through the year. This is the land loss. If you spread it every hour, this is more than a football. This is similar to a football field of land lost every single hour. So that's a lot just for scale. This is an example of the just a close-up of a Landsat time series here, showing the deltas in the Atchafalaya, which are building land. So from 1984, they weren't there, and then suddenly they just show up. So just giving us hope that it's possible to build deltas. So we have several institutions. It's a very multidisciplinary team. Composed of the JPL, where I am, so we're focusing on the remote sensing in particular. We have Louisiana State University, our local partners, Texas, University of Texas, Florida International University, University of North Carolina, and Boston University and the Woods Hole Oceanic Institution. So our team spans engineers from electrical engineers to ecologists and hydrologists. So we have a very wide range of expertise in our group. So the implementation of our campaigns includes the flying 3 aircraft near simultaneously with varying between 4 to 6 boats on the water during the campaigns. And some people, of course, on foot. We're in wetlands, so we can walk around in the water. So the DeltaX framework is as shown here. So we have the 3 layers, the top layers being the remotely sensed measurements of parameters of interest. And at the center here, you have the models. And at the bottom row here is the CalVal datasets, which are collected in situ. So the models are constrained by both the remote sensing measurements and the field measurements. So we are done with the field campaign, the airborne campaigns. They were supposed to be in 2020, but COVID surprised us. So we had to delay by a year. So we had 2 campaigns last year, and that's done. I'll give you a little bit more details about that. And we also had the concurrent field campaigns to calibrate our remote sensing measurements. Right now, we are working on using these measurements to calibrate and validate our hydrodynamic and EcoGeomorphic models. So we had 3 aircraft that flew near simultaneously. The first one is, well, we have 2 radars and 1 optical sensor. The 2 radars focused on hydrological parameters, in particular to measure water level changes within marshes and water surface elevation and slope along river channels along the channel. So these 2 radar measurements are complementary. One measures water level change within the marsh, the other one in open water areas. So we know how much water, the level of water within the channel and the adjacent wetlands. We can measure the impact of changes on each other. So we can look at connectivity of the system through remote sensing measurements. So those are the 2 radars. Well, first one is UAVSAR, the second one is AirSwap. Then we have this third instrument, which is an imaging spectrometer. This is Abris NG, and this one has 2 purposes. One is to look at vegetation structure, and the other one at sediment concentration in the water column in the channels. Okay, so important to note here is that each of these airborne sensors that we've been using has an upcoming spaceborne counterpart. Of course, since we're looking at the coast, it is only with airborne sensors that you can capture very fast dynamic processes like the tide. With the spaceborne counterparts, we're talking about repeat times of 12 days for NISAR, which will be launched in January 2024, and 21 days for SWAT, which will be launched this year in November. Then the SBG, I am not sure when it will be launched, but it should be hopefully by 2028, 2030. So here's the strategy. What we're interested in here is to use remote sensing to calibrate our hydrodynamic models. This is a very dynamic area. We have the tide coming in every day, and we are looking. We try to measure the propagation of the tide inland and as it comes out of the wetlands. So, for example, if you take each of these boxes, so they're pairs of boxes, are basically the radar coverage from UAVSAR. UAVSAR again measures water level change within the marshes. So if we keep repeating, for example, this aqua color boxes, so we keep repeating them over and over, these aircrafts can fly for 6 hours. So we keep flying these two boxes for over 6 hours. We can repeat 8 to 10 times these boxes. That is, we repeat a measurement every about 20 minutes. And this means every when you repeat every 20 minutes, you can measure water level change every 20 minutes everywhere within that box. So we see the tide coming in and out of the system. So we did that 3 times during high tide, low tide, and receding tide. And we did that for those 3 boxes. And we also did that for the spring and the fall. So the spring and fall gives us a way to capture the full range of hydrodynamic states in the system. So in the spring, we have high discharge of the Mississippi River Delta, and we have low vegetation. So vegetation has senesced, it's dead. And then in the fall, which was for us in August, end of August, we have low discharge of the Mississippi River Delta, but peak vegetation biomass. Okay, so we have 2 extreme states of the system. This is the full campaign implementation. We still have here the boxes from the UAVSAR system, so those 3 areas. So in the Terrebonne Basin, which is this polygon, this red polygon is the Terrebonne Basin, and the blue polygon here is the Atchafalaya Basin. So we have the UAVSAR data, and the small red boxes are from the AirSwap system. The SWAT from that system is smaller, thinner, and this AirSwap was flown over open water channels and lagoons. So we cannot see through vegetation with that sensor. We measure water elevation gradients and how it changes with time and as the tide comes in and out of the system. So it's complementary to UAVSAR. We had installed 65 water level gauges across the domain. Those are the pins that you see. The red pins represent water level gauges that were used for the CalVal of our AirSwap system. The yellow ones are more for constraining the hydrodynamic model itself. This is a set of movies from the 3 different aircrafts flying simultaneously over the Terrebonne Basin. That's just one of the day on April 1st. And at the top, you have AirSwap, which looks at changes of water surface elevation and slope as the tide came. I don't remember if that's in or out of the system. And then we have ABRIS-NG, which has a different pattern, and UAVSAR, which is here, which just flies its 2 boxes. ABRIS-NG, you can see these east-west patterns are to make measurements of vegetation structures. We also had flight lines that were dedicated to water quality assessments. But nonetheless, even the vegetation lines here can be used for water quality assessments. When I say water quality, it's sediment concentrations in the water column. At the same time, we had all these boats in the water, and the water level gauges were recording measurements as well. This is a map of those water level gauges that we installed. Those were installed in March of 2021 and retrieved in August and September 2021. So they were there for approximately 6 months to cover both the spring and fall campaign. So these are continuous measurements that span the entire campaign. Okay, just here, just to summarize the three aircrafts, AirSwap measured water surface elevation along channels. So this is an example of an AirSwap measurement along the Wax Lake outlet. So that's one of the rivers on the western side. So you can see that it starts in the north at about 1.8 meters, and then at the mouth of the Wax Lake outlet, it's down to about 80 centimeters. So the river, which is this one right here, over a span of about 25-30 kilometers, has gone down by about 1 meter. So here we're talking of slopes on the order of 1 to 3 centimeters per kilometer. So these systems are extremely shallow, and this is very challenging for measurements. So this type of measurement that you see here has never been seen before, right? This is brand new remote sensing capability. When you have gauges, you typically have 1 or 2 points along that river. If you do, actually, these remote sensing measurements are so accurate that we use them to calibrate our water level gauges. Well, it's actually not the opposite, which is quite it's interesting discovery for for DeltaX. Here is UAV SAR. So UAV SAR doesn't see open water surfaces. It needs vegetation to see the water, because it uses the fact that we have double bounce of the microwave. So the microwave comes in, it hits the water, reflects off the water, hits the stems of the vegetation, and comes back to the radar. So we need vegetation to see water level change here. So if for each single pixel within the UAV SAR image, what you have is a measurement of water level change. So it's as if each of these pixels was a water level gauge. And here are some examples of the UAV SAR measurements as the tide gets out of the system and back in. So you can see the progression of the tidal wave within the wetlands. So this is also a very interesting measurement that allows us to look at connectivity between the channels and the wetlands. And then at the bottom right is a measurement or estimate of sediment, total suspended solids or sediment within the water column. So you see in brown here, it means that we have very high 100 milligrams per liter contents of mineral sediments, but in the Terrebonne Basin, the concentrations are much lower. So remember, this Atchafalaya Basin here is building land, and this one is losing. So this is what's expected when you don't have sediment, is that you will most likely lose land. All right, so we had two campaigns again. The first one was the spring campaign, March 21st, April 22nd, and then August, September to capture the fall state. So in the field, we cannot be everywhere at the same time. We selected 7 sites to represent salinity gradients and also vegetation types. Here are some pictures of different vegetation types, which are controlled by bathymetry. So we collected lots of data on vegetation structure, both above and below ground. We're actually measuring the root biomass, live and also dead biomass. And we're counting the stems because that is also used for the hydrodynamic models. As the vegetation becomes denser, it increases the friction coefficient, right? So we're not only using it for productivity, but also for the hydrodynamic models. At the bottom here, this is the sediment accretion that we are measuring every 6 months. So the smoke that you see here is we're basically freezing the soil cores, because the cores here are very soft. You know, it's mud, so we have to freeze the mud before we extract it. And every 6 months until the end of 2024, we'll be measuring soil accretion, which is whatever soil is above that white marker. So this is like a brick powder. It's called feldspar that we've spread since October 2019. Okay, so we have several measurements: vegetation, water quality, as well as water volume. And some of those measurements are continuous, like the water level gauges. And we also measured flow turbidity continuously in some of the sites. I'm going to accelerate because I think I'm running late. So hydrodynamic models, we need a DEM. This is very important. It controls the hydrology of the system as well as the ecology. So the USGS already had a DEM that they built. It's a little old. So we've been doing our best to improve it. So we collected lots of sonar data as well as ADCP data for discharge, but also taking transects of river bathymetry. We also collected an extra set of green LiDAR data over our 7 sites. So we're improving that DEM. So the hydrodynamic models need, of course, bathymetry, but you also need to constrain the discharge and the tide in the model domain. So at the top, we use USGS stations for discharge. And then we have NOAA's tide gauges that are used to to constrain the tide at the model boundary. So once we set up the model with the friction that follows vegetation type, we can compare the model output, which is on the right here, to our UAVSAR measurements. So the UAVSAR keeps the model real because the UAVSAR is an observation of water level change. So if using the UAVSAR measurements, we can do 2 things. We can modify the friction coefficient and or bathymetry. Bathymetry is the main control here. So we can actually dig the channels. The bathymetry is not perfect from the DEMs that we have, so we can use the UAVSAR measurements to improve our bathymetry. And this is an example here of one of the areas. So this is a measurement from UAVSAR and the corresponding hydrodynamic model output. And you can see the UAVSAR shows a lot more connectivity between the channels and the wetlands. So here what we did is use the UAVSAR measurements to dig the DTM, so the digital terrain model, which is the bathymetry. So this is the initial DTM and the modified one so that the model fits the UAVSAR observations. So once we have the hydrodynamic model running, we can look at sediment transport. And this is an output of that sediment transport. And we look at the deposition across the wetlands. So this is just one example of the Wax Lake Delta. And you can see the sediment hitting the Gulf of Mexico and slow down, and then the tide impact coming in, pushing back on the sediments. So I told you we also had AVEREGE-NG, so we do have a way to constrain water quality, so sediment concentration, and that's with AVEREGE-NG. So we can compare the outputs that we just showed you with observations from AVEREGE-NG. So we're doing that currently. So this is work in progress, of course. So interestingly, this area is extremely dynamic. The tide comes in and out, every day. So our model showed that at falling tide, the channels become eroded. As you can see, the blue here shows it's erosion, and red is deposition of sediment. And then as the tide rises, current slows down, and you have deposition of sediment even within the channels, which was very interesting to see with the models. The models also help us assess or evaluate the role of the channels within the wetlands, the smaller channels. So this is very important. And again, this is in progress. So we're working on this, because this is the objective of DeltaX, is to see how these channels are delivering sediments to across the wetland landscape. So AirSwap, we've been also using AirSwap. So I showed results with UAVSAR, but AirSwap here is being used over the open water surfaces, so not in the wetlands. And you have a very large gradients of several tens of kilometers going from south to north across the Mississippi River Delta. So AirSwap gives us a very nice near instantaneous gradient of water surface elevation. So basically the slope of the water. And using the observed slope, we can try to estimate the friction coefficient and or the bathymetry. And we've been doing that. So here are some AirSwap measurements, which are the blue triangles here, and a few simulations with different friction coefficients. Those are the Sim 2, 4, and 6. That match very well in the southern part of the Terrebonne area. However, when you look at the northern side, the model, which are these 4 lines here, doesn't seem to propagate tide well enough. So we have to play with the model parameters, so bathymetry and friction, so that the observations fit. So it seems like the tide doesn't make it all the way up north in the simulation. So we have to correct that. But again, the remote sensing here keeps the model real, so we're working on that. And we have a lot of water level gauges there. So, but this is a delta that's very well gauged. This is not typical of all deltas around the world. So using AirSwap, we've already been able to improve simulated water level by a significant amount. RMSE went down from 8.7 centimeters down to 6.7 centimeter using the AirSwap calibration. So once the hydrodynamic model is calibrated, we know where water goes and how much sediment there is. We can model sediment deposition across the basin. And this is just one example with deposition and erosion being again blue. Okay, so now we have estimates of mineral sediment deposition across the 2 basins, the Terrebonne and Atchafalaya basins. What about the plants? And how do we merge this hydrodynamic model output with the ecological models, which we call the EcoGeomorphic models? We use a framework here, which is based on objects. So we call them the EcoGeomorphic cells. And these basically, each of these cells that you see here, these segments, represent homogeneous patches of land in terms of vegetation type, structure, and bathymetry. Because bathymetry does control vegetation. So vegetation is telling us something about bathymetry. So we're using these cells as units, and the EcoGeomorphic models are ran for each of these individual cells. So we populate them with everything we've got. So this model, called the Newmar model, that's our EcoGeomorphic model, is the one that we'll be using to forecast sediment deposition and the vulnerability of different parts of the system through 2100. So this model includes, starts with how much mineral sediments are deposited within the system. So that's given to us by the hydrodynamic models. And then we have an initial observation of peak biomass, which is given to us by ABRIS-NG and the in situ measurements, of course. So using that, we have contribution, the mineral contribution and the organic contribution. And on a yearly step, we'll be predicting how much soil, both mineral and organic, is being accumulated through year 2100. So again, just this is just a diagram showing a summary of what we're doing. So using these EcoGeomorphic cells, we populate them with all the information that includes the sediment deposition, the yearly sediment deposition, and we also have the plant production that's included in each of these EcoGeomorphic cells. And the output of all this is annual accretion rates. So I think this I basically mentioned. So this is the mineral sediment deposition. So each of the cells are populated with this, which happens to be an output of the hydrodynamic models. We have measurements of the initial above ground biomass, which we'll be delivering to ORNL next week. And from that, we have an output for the entire landscape of sediment accretion rate per year. We're still working on this is a preliminary result, but we're still working on the calibration. So this model, Newmar, includes decomposition rates by bacteria and other processes, erosion processes, and it works on, again, on an annual step. So this model simulation here that you're seeing is definitely not the final one. This is just a one-year run. So lesson learned. I think you guys sent me a questionnaire with and I did reply to that. So I figured this is something you wanted to know. This is, I guess, food for discussion, food for thoughts. Just like in the housing market, you know, location. This I'm talking postdoc. And because somebody has to do the work, the PIs and co-Is, you know, we're just, I have a lot of presentations, a lot of administrative tasks that I'm have to deal with. So people that actually do the handwork, coding, and putting all the data sets together are the postdocs and PhD candidates. Personal continuity is critical. EVS 3s are 5-year projects. This one was kind of a hybrid because we were funded at the threshold level. So we had some people were 3 years, some others were 5. Then COVID hit, delayed us by 1 year. So 1 out of 3 years is it's a hard hit for us. You know, postdocs are typically 2 years. So you have to deal with personnel change. So it's you have to do good planning. Typically hiring a new postdoc is 9 months because you have to advertise, you have to interview, there's a bunch of administrative things. So by the time the postdoc starts, it's 9 months have gone. So it's planning personnel is important, and you know, they can leave after a year. So having overlap is extremely important as well. Somebody has to be able to take over when someone leaves. Having partial duplicates at the head institution, in this case at JPL, is really important to keep everything roll smoothly. Having backup plans for aircrafts, instrument, team members, and of course fund reserves is also very important. We did have some aircraft issue on the fall campaign. They had, I think, the door on the airplane didn't work, so we had to call our backup to come, which was another AFRC, Armstrong, instead of Houston. So Johnson, I mean. So it's very important to have backups. For us, you know, I told you about these very challenging areas where we're looking for centimeter measurements. You know, we have water surface slopes of 1 to 3 centimeters per kilometer. This is a very, very flat. So vertical datum is major. We've been having issues, a lot of issues with vertical datum using different data sets, whether it be from USGS or companies, LiDAR companies. We've been struggling with the vertical datum for the epoch and which geoid was used, which it's incredible how complicated that is. So plan for deliveries and format structure. Assigning responsibility to an individual is also very important. Somebody has to keep track of everything that's happening. There's a lot of moving parts and a very interdisciplinary team. So having one person doing communications for a given data set is keeping tab on everything is very important. Okay, so those are plans more specific to DeltaX. I think that's a bit more too much details, but we have a nice website where we explain the mission, and we also distribute the data. Most of these links go to the ORNL DAC. We also use that because when we publish, we have to already publish the data sets. So this is much faster if we have our own. I just call Sarah and Sarah puts it on tomorrow. So we can publish really fast our data sets, which is a requirement. And then after we switch to links to the ORNL. And I'm going to stop here. This is my last slide.
Thank you, Marc. We really appreciate you being with us and sharing all those